Hello, good afternoon. My name is Maureen Kerner. Welcome to day 3 of a four-part webinar series focused on funding water programs and projects in Nevada. I am the Associate Director of the Environmental Finance Center at California State University, Sacramento, otherwise known as Sac State. And with not more ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. A little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. We'll be sending you a link to the video shortly after the webinar completion today. We do have the slides. They're currently available to you in chat if you wanted to download them now. Another option is that probably in a couple of weeks, we'll have them posted to our EFC website that you can access as well. We will be notifying you when those are available. If you have questions, we're taking them in written form today. So in your go-to webinar panel, you can go through questions or chat and put your questions in there, and I'll read them off to the speakers for you at that time and for later discussion. We do have time for a Q&A for each speaker. Our first speaker, I'll go through it then, but she'll be taking questions kind of on and off through her presentation, Heather Himmelberger, and then Truckee Meadows Water Authority staff, where we'll wait to the end for those. But you can go ahead and send your questions in at any time. For more information, you can always email me. I provided my email here, and then our EFC at Sac State website link is there for you too, and you'll be seeing that throughout the presentations today. A big shout out to our sponsors who managed to put this together, particularly the particularly the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. They are a large sponsor for several different grants to the individual environmental finance centers as well as the Environmental Finance Center Network. I'll talk about those groups in a little bit. Particular environmental finance centers are out of that are supporting today our office at Sacramento State, Syracuse University, Southwest Environmental Finance Center at University of New Mexico, and then the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And then also this was all started by conversations with Jason Cooper at the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection and identifying some needs to talk about project and program funding in Nevada. So thanks to all those for the support and bringing some great information to you today, and as well as last week, and coming up again on Thursday, our next one. So I mentioned the Environmental Finance Center Network. We're a group of 10 different centers located, one in each region of US EPA. We have focus on small systems, but pretty much environmental management needs for utilities, water utilities, waste management utilities, even some commercial and industrial businesses doing their waste management or sustainability actions, and that. All kinds of different services available to you here. We can help with asset management if you're interested in taking another look at rate developments or sustainability and resiliency, fiscal planning, leak detection, GIS programming and planning. We do all kinds of trainings, like the rest of the world, pretty much online over the last year or so, but looking forward to start doing those in person again, all over the country in different realms. We also do not personal, but site-specific or utility-specific technical assistance, where we can help you either remotely or come to your site and help with your various needs. The EFCN does have funding from the US EPA to do that through grants. So if you're interested, I'm going to have Tess put the link in chat, and it's a website that you can go to and request technical assistance. You put your information there, and then the kind of type of service that you're looking for, and you can be connected with one of the centers that can help you out. Alternatively, you could always contact our office at Sac State also, and we can connect you there. So we're located in Region 9 on the beautiful American River at California State University, Sacramento. The Region 9 EFC is housed in the Office of Water Programs. We've been around for about 50 years. Professors started developing manuals for training drinking water, wastewater operators and managers. Since then, we've pulled them out to online courses and trainings throughout the country. And then about 30 years ago, we started a research group that focused on mainly technical and managerial assistance to state and local agencies, particularly focused in stormwater. We've, in the past 10, 15 years, we've branched out to all different realms of the water world. In 2016, we were fortunate to become one of the environmental finance centers. So we got to add that financial capacity to our already technical managerial capacity expertise. We also develop a lot of tools and do training such as this one. So while our focus is in Region 9, or we're located in Region 9, all these different centers, like I mentioned before, through the network, overlap and go to different places and work in different areas. So you'll hear from Heather Himmelberger today, who works for the EFC out of New Mexico, but she's been doing work in California and Hawaii and Tennessee and all over outside of her region. So again, I invite you to take advantage of some of these resources here if you're looking for support, especially capacity development. So why are we here? How did this all happen today? As pretty much many people know, if you're in the water industry, there's so many needs, a growing demand on water programs. Drainage infrastructure, any kind of your water utility infrastructure is aging. There's all kinds of impacts from climate change. There's greater floods, more droughts, more severe fires, and that. There's decline and depletion of groundwater, there's new contaminants, and there's a whole lot of changing and new regulations. And all those things come down to, you're gonna need more money, and where are you gonna get that money from? So we decided to put this this webinar together in conversation, like I said, with Jason Cooper out of Nevada Department of Environmental Protection. The intent is to really acknowledge, while there are a lot of challenges for funding water programs and projects, and trying to get some discussions going, learning a little bit more about these challenges and then what we can do about them. So maybe it's within the grant and loan process, there's limits or burdens of completing applications. There's barriers for getting fees or fees in place. There's insufficient grant or loan funds. In some states, it can be very competitive. A lot of times we hear that staff time and capacity is insufficient. So really, again, what we wanted to do is focus, not only acknowledge those challenges, but focus on some strategies to overcome those challenges. So put a series of, throughout the days, this webinar series of tips to address the needs. So we talked about last week organizing program activities and estimating costs. We wanted to show how to develop sustainable revenue streams, plan projects, choosing consultants and experts, developing applications, understanding funding opportunities. So the result was the set of 4 webinar series. And like I said, today is day 3, the second week. Last week we had days 1 and 2, and we focused on understanding program costs and funding options. And then we also looked at pursuing sustainable funding streams and revenues. We had a series of speakers and presentations. Those are available now on the EFCN website for download or watching the video. If you've missed them, they'll also be on our EFC at Sac State website coming soon. A lot of great discussions too, so not just speakers, but some really good kind of back and forth discussions as well and perspectives. So moving forward into week number 2 on days 3 and 4, we're focusing now on project funding. Last week, we kind of looked at overall programs. What is everything a utility doing? Is it filling out permit forms, reporting, doing operation and maintenance, replacing infrastructure? And then we're transitioning now more at that replacing infrastructure and project funding, or maybe it's redevelopment or new development that you're doing, those capital improvement projects. So today we're going to be focusing on tips and strategies for developing projects and preparing to obtain funding. And then I invite you to join us again Thursday for the last day of our webinar. We've got a whole bunch of speakers from different local, federal, and state agencies that are going to be coming and talking and presenting their funding opportunities, their programs, and the money, of whether it be grants or loans that they have available. We'll talk about the eligibility requirements, as well as kind of putting their face out there for you to know who they are, and encourage you to approach them and help and look at these project planning and going after applications and answering whatever questions you might have. So today, like I said, we're going to be focusing on developing projects and preparing to obtain funding. I'm Maureen Kerner again, and I'm getting through my welcome here. In a little bit, I'll be handing it over to the director at the Southwest Environmental Finance Center, Heather Himmelberger, and she'll be focusing on how to plan projects, preparing applications, working with consultants and engineers. And then we're going to hear, we will take a little bit of a 5-minute break and then come back. And then we've got staff from Truckee Meadows Water Authority, Cara Steeland and Matt Bauman, have agreed to come and present to you. They've developed an integrated approach to water resource facility and funding plans. And then we'll close it out with a quick recap and remind you again about the next session coming up on Thursday. So before we move forward, we'll go ahead and do a poll. I'll turn it over to Tess, and so we can find out who's all with us today.
Awesome, thanks Maureen. So we would love to know if you could tell us what type of organization you represent. Pick the one that describes you the best way you can. We want to know if you represent a small municipality, a medium municipality or water system, a large municipality or water system, whether you're in consulting or education. And it looks like we have about 40% of people that have submitted a response so far. So I'm going to leave the poll open for maybe 5 more seconds, closing the poll in 3, 2, and 1. Okay, and as far as the results go, it looks like 22% of folks are joining from some sort of educational background, whether you're an agency or capacity coordinator or something like that, or higher ed. We have a good split between our small systems and medium systems, and then also a decent number, 33% of consultants on the line, and a few more water systems.
Wonderful, thanks. Thanks everybody. Thank you, Tess, and thanks again everybody for a good variety of folks logging in here today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to let Heather Himmelberger take it from here. She'll tell you a lot more about the Environmental Finance Center network, as well as the services she provides out of New Mexico. A little bit about Heather. She's a registered professional engineer with over 35 years of experience working with water and wastewater utilities and in the environmental arena. She has worked for the Southwest Environmental Finance Center since 1994 and became its director in '96. As director, she has assisted state, local, and tribal governments with the broad financial implications of providing water and wastewater services and complying with state and federal regulations. Ms. Himmelberger's work with water and/or wastewater systems covers all 50 states and all 5 U.S. territories. This broad geographic vision provides an excellent understanding of the issues facing all types of systems, but particularly small systems. Her specialties include asset management, water loss, regulatory compliance, funding, collaborations, and technical, managerial, and financial capacity development. She provides training and direct technical assistance to water and wastewater utilities of all sizes. So with that, Heather, thanks for joining us and take it away.
Sure, and I just want to thank you all for having me here today. And again, my name is Heather Himmelberger. I'm the director of the Southwest EFC, and I do want to share that I have an office mate today, and I want to share who that office mate is. So hopefully you see my old pug laying in the chair in the back. So if you hear some rumbling, something that sounds like snoring, I have not fallen asleep while doing this presentation. I just wanted to let you know that it's my office mate in the back there, and he just loves coming to work, so it's hard to keep him out. But anyway, that's the noise you hear if you hear a noise in the background. So what we want to talk about today is kind of getting your projects ready to go and preparing funding. So we have a whirlwind of things to cover today, all things projects. So let's just jump right into it. And a little bit later on, I'll show you where you can get resources and talk a little bit more about the EFCN. But we're going to jump in right now to the major steps in the funding process. And again, as a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box as we go. So a good starting place is, do you really have a problem that needs solved? And it might sound obvious that that would be the case, but you really need to start here first. Do you actually have a problem that needs to be solved? And, would addressing that problem actually improve service to your customers? And we're going to come back to each of these as we go on. So if you resolve this problem, would your customer service improve? Is there any data to back up the need for this project that you have? And is there a problem that needs, if there is a problem that needs to be solved, do you know the best way to solve that problem? So what are the alternatives that you have that would help you solve the problem? And then will solving the problem involve the addition of assets? Do you have to actually do some construction? And is there a non-asset way to solve the problem? So is there something you can do to solve the problem that doesn't actually require you to put in any assets at all? And then will you need to engage outside professionals, including engineers, to help you plan for the project, design the project, or construct the project? And finally, can you afford to pay for the project yourself out of your reserves or other internal funds? And if not, will you need to seek outside funding? And then our last thing that we're going to talk about today is whether you need to build internal capacity to qualify for funding, accomplish the project, or achieve sustainability. And I should have asked Tess this before, but I just want to make sure that my screen is sharing properly and my webcam is working and that the volume is okay. Could you just verify that, Tess, that we're doing okay?
It sounds great and looks fantastic, Heather. All good.
Okay, thank you. I meant to ask before I got going, and then I thought, oops, I forgot to ask. So thank you for that, Tess. So on the screen is the basic steps that I just talked about, and we're going to go through each one of these in more detail. So we're going to talk about identifying the need, making sure that we're looking at customer service, talk about data, look at alternatives, talk about engaging our professionals and working collaboratively with them, identifying funding sources, and then building internal capacity to accomplish the project. And since we don't have tons of time, it's going to be a whirlwind tour for all these, to go through all these, but there is assistance available in any of these areas if you should need it. So let's start with identifying the need for the project. So what problem are you trying to solve? So you want to clearly articulate the problem that needs solving. If you can't articulate it well internally, like basically within your staff, within your utility, to your bosses, it's going to be very difficult to explain the project to anyone else, especially your funders. It's also really difficult to develop RFPs for planners, engineers, or other professionals when you don't have a well-defined project. So this is really the absolute starting place, is you have to articulate that problem that needs solving. And you'd be surprised how many times that is not the case, where I will come into a utility, they know something's wrong, but they can't clearly articulate the problem. And that's an okay starting place, but you really want to work on resolving that issue before you get too far down the road. You really want to start thinking about, what is the problem I'm trying to solve, and articulate it really well before you move beyond this step. So as you're identifying and articulating the problem, you want to think about what the risks are of not doing the project. So if I don't do it, what bad things might happen? And what are the benefits if I do it? And we want to think financial, environmental, and social. So these three categories are considered the triple bottom line, if you've ever heard that terminology. So it's money, people, and the environment. So anything related to people is your social. Anything with, the air, the water, regulatory is typically what we consider environmental. And then, of course, financial is anything related to the money. So we want to think about risks and benefits very, very carefully of what happens if I don't do the project. Are bad things going to occur? What happens beneficially if I do the project? Next, we want to think about, will the benefits include improving service to your customers in any way? So we're going to get into this in a little more detail in just a second, but if you're not going to benefit your customers in any way, should the project actually proceed? Why is the project being done if your customers are not going to benefit? And if they are going to benefit, in what way do they benefit? So now let's go into a few words about why we're worrying about this customer service idea. So water utilities are first and foremost customer service businesses. So everything you do should be about the customers. And the service we provide in sort of asset management terms, we call that level of service. And it includes setting goals for what we want our assets to do. So what we're trying to provide our customers, we write goals out that are measurable and we can tell if we've met the goals or not. And so level of service becomes your roadmap that tells you how you're, where you're going and how you're going to get there in the most efficient way. So similarly to how a roadmap has all kinds of roads on it, and there's all kinds of ways you can get from here to there. So if I was to go from where I am in New Mexico to where Maureen is in Sacramento, there's a lot of different paths I could go. And I could even go all the way to Maine and come all the way back. And that's an okay way to do it. It's just that it's going to be very inefficient and very cost prohibitive to do it that way versus going directly. So that's kind of what your level of service goals are. They're to help you figure out where to spend your money and how to spend it. So you might ask yourself, why would we be caring about level of service and level of service goals as part of funding our infrastructure projects? Well, it goes back again to the fact that how the project affects customer service is really important. And if the project doesn't have any positive impact on the level of service, it's probably not the right project. So there's most everything should impact the customers positively. So if it doesn't, then you might want to rethink what you're doing and how you're doing it, because it really is important that your customers benefit. And then it's also important to think about how much does the project cost compared to what is the increase in customer service going to be. So are the customer service improvements worth the cost that you're going to pay? So if it's a minor improvement in customer service, but it costs a lot of money, maybe you might want to rethink that. Maybe there's an alternative. Maybe you shouldn't do the project. On the other hand, if there's a big customer service improvement and small cost, it makes a lot of sense to go forward. So you do want to think about how your customers are going to be impacted, because they're the ones who are going to pay for the project. And so you need to be able to tell them, what are they going to get for whatever they're paying for the project? What are they going to get out of it? And you might think, hey, if I got a grant, my customers aren't really paying. And that's actually not true, because even if a grant pays 100% of the costs of your project, you still have to operate and maintain that project going forward. There will still be costs accrued from whatever you do on your customers going forward. So there is no such thing as a free project. Your customers will pay no matter where the funding comes from. Sometimes they pay more, sometimes they pay less, depending on where you get the funding from. But you want to be able to tell them what are the benefits of the project. They're going to see themselves for what they're paying. And, the more you can express that in a positive way, the more supportive they will be. So for example, if there's a water quality problem and your project is going to improve that water quality, then they should be very supportive, because it's a public health issue and they should want to have better water. So we do have some resources to help with goal setting, and there's one on the screen and there's a link to it down below. A little later on, I'll show you where you can get other resources related to asset management, but here's one related specifically to the goals. So moving on to the next part, we want to use data to back up the need for our project. So we want to think about, if we have a need for a project like we talked about before, there's some problem we're trying to solve, what data backs up the need for that project? So what information do we have? Do we have regulatory violations that show that? Do we have sample data from water quality? Do we have break data for pipes? What is it that backs up the need for this project? Is that data compelling? Would it be compelling to a funder? Do we need to collect more data, or do we want to look at different data? Is there something missing that we might have to include in order to do this project? And I want to share an example with you. This is a very real world example for a community that we worked with. We had actually started working with them after they had already put in for a $5 million project to do pipe replacement. And this particular project was going to be a grant loan combo that they were seeking. So they wanted to replace all the pipe in their system. There's a couple hundred customers in this particular system. All the pipe was PVC. And it seemed rather odd to us that they wanted to replace, all the pipe. So we asked them about the project and they said, well, our pipe is old and it breaks a lot. So we said, do you really need to do this project? So we started questioning them a little bit more, how old is the pipe? Well, it's about 35 years old. And right away, red flags started going off because 35-year-old plastic pipe is not that old. So we asked them about the breaks and they said, well, it's just a lot, but they had no data to actually back up what a lot meant. So we had to go about trying to collect that data. So we worked with the utility and we found ways to get data related to the number of breaks and location of breaks in their utility. And then we created a little map and we put the breaks on there, and there's color-coded dots mean different things. And what we found out was that one year there was 5 breaks and the next year there was 6, and it was actually the opposite. It was 6 breaks the older year and 5 breaks the newer year. And a lot of those breaks were related to just digging up the pipe. So it's shallow buried dirt roads. So people would be doing projects. They didn't do the one call that they're supposed to, and they would dig the pipe out of the ground. So replacing the pipe wasn't going to fix that problem. And then there's another part. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but there's a bunch of blue dots all clustered kind of together on the big line. And if you see that cluster of dots, it was actually a problem with a thrust restraint missing. And so the same place, it kept breaking over and over again. So replacing the pipe, maybe they would have thrust restrained that joint, but you didn't have to go through replacing the pipe to solve this problem. So they didn't really have the problem they thought they had. And furthermore, there are better ways to solve the problem. So you might ask, well, what was the outcome? The outcome was we told them to focus on customer service. So you started this thinking that, there was a problem that you were trying to solve, but you would have inconvenienced the customers, cost them a lot of money to really not solve much of a problem. So is there another way to look at this with customer service more in mind? And they said, well, we really need some loop lines. We need a couple of extra isolation valves. We need to fix that thrust restraint and put a couple hydrants in there, and that would improve customer service. So that's what they did, and it cost $50,000 to do the project that they ended up doing. They could do most of the work themselves, and so ultimately the data and trying to use the data to show that they were on the wrong track, plus bringing in customer service, saved the community $4.95 million. So data can be your friend. It can help you back up the need. It can help you figure out if the need is maybe different than what you thought. So you really want to think about how data shows or doesn't show the need for that project and use that to help you going forward. So make sure that you're looking at data and how that informs the project. Then we want to think about examining all the alternatives, including non-asset alternatives. So at the early stages of a project, again, when you're thinking about a project and you have a problem, so let's assume that the project addresses a problem that is backed up by data. So we just went through the step of finding data. We've figured out that we do have this problem. It will improve customer service. So we're ready to move on to the next step. Another type of project might be those that are not well defined, they're not backed up by data, the costs are not quite justified based on customer service improvements. So the project is not quite right or it doesn't address the right issues. In those cases, we're going to have to look at variations on this, like holding off for right now. And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. And then finally, our last set of projects are those that are really not needed. The data shows that it isn't needed in any way, shape, or form, or it's not the right time to do the project, and we don't want to move forward with the project. So let's look at the first category. So those projects that are backed up by data, we do have customer service improvements, we want to move to the next step. So the next step of the process is really going to be looking at what are the possible ways to address the issue. So what are those alternative ways of doing something? And then we always want to think about whether there's a non-asset solution, meaning we don't have to construct something to solve the problem at hand. So let's try an example. This is Green Village, and they want a third well to provide additional capacity for their system. They have a large per capita water use, which is 125 gallons per capita per day, and it's a lot higher than neighboring systems. So neighboring systems have like 80 gallons per capita per day on average, so they're quite a bit higher than the neighbors. There's also relatively high water loss in the system, which means that they're experiencing a big difference between how much water they produce and how much water they sell. And then the water system manager is afraid the system won't be able to keep up in the future, which is why he's thinking that they need another well. So based on the information at hand, what alternatives might exist to address the need? Is construction the only option, or could they do maintenance? And then are there any non-asset solutions? So let's think about construction alternatives. So if we did want to go through the alternative of having a new well, what kind of alternatives might there be there? So we always want to think about, is there any alternative for surface versus well? And a lot of times, I live in an arid place, Nevada is an arid place. There may very well not be a surface source option, but if there is, we'd want to look at that just to make sure, which is better. We want to think about the location of the well. So where are the various, where are the various places you could put the well, and why would one location maybe be better than another? What aquifer or aquifers are you going to tap to try to get water? And then what's the size of the well? Do we want to have a bigger well or two smaller ones? So there's always lots of alternatives, and I've yet to see a project where there's not more than one alternative. So there's always something you can do that's different than maybe just, having one possible idea and nothing else. So here's some possible construction alternatives. I'm sure you could think of some more, but just to give you an idea of what those alternatives might be. We might also want to think about, are there any maintenance alternatives? So instead of drilling a new well, is there something we could do to the existing wells to maybe make them work better? So is there possibly well cleaning or rehabilitation that could be done that might increase the amount of water we could get from the existing wells, because maybe they've been clogging over time, or they've not been producing as much water. And so if we go in and clean them or rehabilitate them in some way, maybe we could get more flow out of the existing wells and not have to drill a new well. What about non-asset solutions? So are there non-asset solutions we could consider for the project? So what about customer conservation programs? So we talked about the fact that there's a higher per capita usage in this community than neighboring communities. So maybe the customers just aren't used to what conservation is all about. Or maybe we need a rebate program to install low flow devices, or we want to work on outside yards and maybe incentivize people to go from grass to xeriscaping or something like that. Or maybe we have a large commercial user, and that commercial user or users are driving up the gallons per capita per day because they're being inefficient, or maybe they can do some internal recycling or something like that. So there might be non-asset solutions where you don't have to drill a well at all, but you solve the problem through some other means. So let's look at this alternative evaluation process then. If we're going to look at, say, all of these options as part of the project, and we're going to look at construction options, non-asset options, and then the maintenance options, we want to make sure that we are getting the full range of options. So how are the alternatives chosen? Is it only the engineer? So let's say this is all being done by an engineer, and likely you have some kind of professional working for you at this point. Do the operators or managers get to input into this process? Do they get to say alternatives that they would like evaluated? And if not, they really should be able to. Do you get to see an initial list to comment on that initial list of alternatives to make sure it fits your needs? Are all the viable alternatives considered, or only certain types of alternatives? So, you don't want the professional who's working with you to ignore certain types of alternatives, like for example, the maintenance alternatives. If that's a viable alternative, you want to consider it. It may not be the way you go, but you at least want to look at it and make sure that's considered. Or if they're not considering non-asset solutions, that's a problem as well, because you at least want to look at that and see if there's a way, even if it doesn't solve the whole problem, if you do some conservation and reduce the use, maybe you need a smaller well, so you can save some money that way. You want all alternatives given equal consideration. You don't want one to be preordained as the alternative. And you want any alternative suggested by the operators or managers given serious consideration. And it might sometimes seem like a good idea that if we just sort of pick a solution right at the get-go, and that could either be the engineer or the system who pick an option and say, this is it, I don't want to look at anything else, this is what we want to do. I would like to say resist that temptation. Really let the process itself determine the best alternative. And sometimes you're going to find out what you thought was the best alternative might not be. So, be really careful about trying to drive yourself in one direction and not, look at other things that might come up. And then think about the long-term cost of the alternative. So oftentimes we're only looking at the construction cost, and we get real short-sighted because we're just looking at, what's the cheapest thing to construct today? But that's not all that you're going to be using it for. You're going to have that in service for 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, depending on what the assets are. So you have to look at long-term costs, not just the cost of the alternative initial construction. So thinking about what are the operation and maintenance costs over time? What are the implications for certification of operators? What are short and long-term replacement costs going to be? What is energy use or energy efficiency? How is that impacted by the project? What is the water use or water efficiency impacts? And, what do you have going on in terms of source water protection? Does the project address any of those issues? So really think about the full life cycle of the project, not just the initial construction costs. And then you want to think about whether any new technologies are being considered. And this can be good or bad. So sometimes new technologies are really the answer. They've come on to, on the scene, and they're cheaper and better and all of that. Sometimes they're off the mark, and you're going to be the guinea pig to try out a new technology and find out it doesn't work. So you really have to look at both sides of the new technology sort of spectrum. And if it's been used somewhere else, talking to those utilities, find out if it's working for them. And if it's not, do you really want to go down this path? And then after you get the write-up of the alternatives, what does that look like? Are they written up as if they were all considered equally? Or are they written up, that is not the case, that, it was pretty much looked like it was preordained? And I used to review a lot of SRF, state revolving fund documentation on alternatives analysis, and I could pretty much tell right away if, one alternative was kind of chosen at the beginning versus, a serious look at all the alternatives. So it is really important to look at the documentation and make sure that all of them were given the same consideration. So just a couple of examples of why this process is so important. We had one water utility that we came into the picture after they had just finished construction, and found out that this particular utility had reverse osmosis installed. And that's a little bit unusual for, water utilities in this area. So we asked the question, oh, what was the contaminant you were trying to take out? Why did you need reverse osmosis? And it was kind of deer in the headlights sort of thing. And everybody was kind of looking at us like, well, stuff, like, well, what stuff? What was in the water? And it turned out that as we dug deeper, there was absolutely no reason for reverse osmosis to be put in. There was nothing they were trying to take out. It was just that, the person who designed it thought reverse osmosis was great, put it into this utility, and set them up for a pretty much lifetime of the facility set of problems, because it uses lots of energy, it's very expensive. It caused copper pipe problems. They had some copper exceedances, so it was just a mess. So it was really important, it's important to consider the alternatives, because this poor system is going to be stuck with this for a long time. We had another example where a system chose to do a tank rehab over a tank replacement because their alternatives process showed that for a very small fraction of the cost, they could buy themselves about 15 to 20 years by lining a tank rather than replacing it. We had another system that, this is one back when we were reviewing SRF projects. The system had ignored a lot of cheaper and better alternatives, and they had to go back and redo the alternatives analysis process because of it. We had a system, this is a case again where people don't always like to have that collaborative relationship, which we're going to talk about later, where an operator indicated that the storage tank elevations were not going to work, but the operator was ignored, and after the system was installed, it did not work properly. The elevations were messed up, and they had to fix the problem, and it cost a lot of money. And the last example I'll give you is a disinfection system that was designed, and it was operationally impossible for the operator. So it looked good on paper, but the entryway was too small, and there was no way to get the operator and the chlorine into that opening, so they had to redesign it. So why is it so important to consider these issues early in the process? So I want to bring up just the famous kind of cost curves for construction projects. When we're at the beginning of a project where the blue shaded box is, we have the most influence, which is the top curve, our influence curve, which goes from high influence to low influence as we move along the spectrum. And then our cost curve, which is low cost to high cost. So when we're at the beginning of a project and we're in planning, when we're doing preliminary engineering reports and that type of thing, we have maximum influence at the least cost. So we really want to consider our alternatives at this point because it's going to cost us a whole lot more money later on if we don't do it now. So let's go back to the projects in that second category. And these are ones where we're maybe off track a little bit and we want to change the process up a little bit, maybe change the project. So if we go back to our Green Village example, Green Village is considering a project that would include installing a new well, but they have this water loss problem. So maybe they're off on the wrong track, and what they really need to be doing is addressing their water loss issues. So maybe they need pipe replacement, meter replacement, or some other project. Instead of a new well, maybe there's something they could do with that water loss problem. So maybe they're actually trying to do the wrong problem. And the most important thing really is that we want the best project to go forward. So it isn't about stopping projects, it's about having you do the most efficient, cost-effective, and best thing for your utility. So in the final category, and sometimes it's just not the right time to move forward with a project, so you just need to put the project off. So let's now talk about engaging our professionals and working with them collaboratively. So back to the, oh yes.
This is Maureen. I was just going to interrupt you quick. It's not a question, but it was a comment that said, didn't, for the Green Village example, didn't they look at some kind of water loss project? So thinking ahead.
Yep, that's exactly what you want to be doing. You want to be thinking about those alternatives, and you're right on the right track. If you look at a project and you say, wait a minute, are we missing something? That's probably a good time to look at it. So you're perfectly on the right track.
Great, thank you.
So let's recall that, again, the best time to intervene in the projects and to keep our costs down and have the greatest impact is really the first couple of parts. The pre-planning, planning, pre-design, and then that design process. And as we move into construction, it becomes really expensive to change things. You're talking about change orders, and anybody who's ever been through construction, if you have to do a change order, you're going to pay a lot of money. And then finally, by the time you get the facility turned over to you, most of the costs are sunk. So you have whatever assets you have made out of whatever material they're made out of, placed wherever they're placed, and you don't really have a lot of options on what to do about it at that point. So typically, if your project involves some kind of construction, you're going to have outside professionals involved. So the two issues we want to think about is how do we engage these professionals and how do we work collaboratively with them. So typically, we're doing some kind of request for a proposal process to engage professionals, where we put out what we want the professional to do, and then they propose back to us what they're going to do. And then you have a selection process to pick the right person or the right group for your job. So a couple of thoughts on RFPs. You really want to make sure the scope of the work is well defined. The better defined scope of work you have, the better able professionals are to apply back to you in a proposal that makes sense. Anytime the project is not well defined, they're going to have to add a lot of contingencies because they're afraid that they're going to underbid it, or they don't know exactly what you want. So you really want to have the scope well defined so that they know exactly what they're bidding for and how many hours that's going to take and that sort of thing. You want to have clearly thought out selection criteria, and you want to use them. So how are you going to select the professionals? What are the key things? How many points do you get for different parts? And when you actually go through the process, make sure you use the selection criteria that you tell them you're going to use. Make sure you have an RFP review team that's diverse. Even if you bring in outsiders, it doesn't necessarily have to be just people on in your utility. There might be others who are able to be on a team with you. I've actually sat in on a couple of teams like this to just help guide people through the process. So think about having a pretty diverse team of people, so that, and by diverse, I mean positions within the organization, so that you have different viewpoints like operators and managers and that type of thing. Keep an open mind during selection. Choose the best choice for you, not necessarily the people you know the best, but who's going to give you the best service for that particular project. And it can be very project specific. So one type of professional might work great for one kind of project, and you might want a different one for a different kind of project. And try to avoid promising design for help in the application. So if somebody's willing to help you with your application, that's great, but make sure that they understand it's still an independent process to select who's ever going to do the design, so that it's not sort of a guarantee that just because we help with the application, we'll get the design. And indicate in the RFP that you really want a collaborative relationship with your engineer. This is not an us and them thing, this is a we thing, because we really want to remember that design and operations are absolutely connected together, and the best design won't achieve its purpose without good operations, and the best operations won't fix a poor design. So they're two sides of the same coin. They're both super, super important. We need both for the system to work properly. And we want operations to be thought of as an integral part of design. So as you're picking what types of treatment or assets or anything, that's going to set up the operations, because that sets in motion what kinds of spare parts you need and what kind of operator training you need and what kind of repairs you're going to make. So it's really important to think about that as part of design. So we really want to have these good relationships with our engineer. And I like to use this analogy of if you're building a house. So if you're building a house, would you just turn it all over to the architect and stay completely out of it and say, well, you just come back when the whole house is built? I mean, you're not really going to do that. You're going to want to decide, how many bedrooms or where the kitchen is or what the kitchen looks like or where your sinks go or how many you have. And we really want to have a collaborative relationship like that, the same way we have it with a home builder. We would want to have it with water and wastewater projects. We want to have that collaborative relationship, because the system better than the engineer does, but the engineer knows design better than you do. So if we blend both together, we get the best of both worlds.
Heather, there was a quick question about RFPs. Do you want to take that one? Does the EFCN provide assistance in developing RFPs? Many utilities have outdated RFP templates, do not reflect current way of business or funding requirements.
Yes, we have helped with that. And we have helped people. I don't do any of the boilerplate stuff, that's, specific to a community, all this stuff about insurances and things like that. But the scope part, we will usually try to help a community think through the scope. And it's like a guided process for trying to guide that community through what do you want to have in the scope for your RFP, because that's the part that really matters, is the, what goes into that scope of work of what the engineer is going to do. So yeah, we can help with that.
Great, thank you.
And let me see. So here's an example from Iowa. This is one where I think is probably one of the best I've seen, where they really involved the engineers and operators together, and they were very much a team. And the picture at the upper right-hand corner of the screen is actually a 3D model that they created. And in that 3D model, the operators were kind of able to operate the utility, you know, through little, like they had little figurines or whatever that they could move through the plant. And they found a couple of mistakes that were being made that you wouldn't have known until you tried to operate the facility. And all of those things could be fixed during the design phase, and it made the operations better. So I think the quote kind of sums it up there, that others are handed a system and told to make it work. We were involved the whole time and it was our system. And they felt that it was hugely beneficial to them, like on all sides. They said the engineers really liked the process, the operators really liked the process. And at the end, it was so much easier for them to start up the facility and a lot fewer maintenance issues and all of that. So that collaborative relationship was great for both sides. And I really want to stress that, and I can't stress it enough, that what I'm after is positive for both sides. It's not an us and them again, it's a we. We want to work collaboratively with our folks. So now let's talk a little bit about applying for funding. So you have funding options. You can use your own funding from your reserves or your rates. You can use federal or state loans and grants. You can use outside sources like bonds and private banks. So we want to think about, you know, what is the total amount of money you need? Because the more money you need, probably the less likely you're going to have that in reserves. You want to think about how long those assets are going to last, and, you know, how much of today's customers pay for tomorrow or vice versa, because that can change what type of funding you consider. The amount of money you have in your own funds, like do you actually have a lot of money in reserves or just a little bit? Whether you have any expected changes in the community. Is the community growing really fast or is it shrinking? You know, that can change your decisions about what to do. And then your ability to apply for funds. So do you have eligibilities for federal and state grants and loans? Do you have eligibilities for bonds and that type of thing? And then the overall cost of the money, because depending on what you do, the money might cost more or less based on the interest rates and how long the terms are and all that sort of stuff. So if you're going to use your own sources, were any of them set up for replacing assets? You know, you have to look at those reserves and whether that money could be used in that way. You want to think about your current rates. You know, can the rates be raised and some of that be used for that sort of thing? If you're going to go outside like bonds and that sort of thing, you have to figure out if you're eligible for that type of funding. And sometimes if you're a private utility, maybe the only choices you have are private sources of money like a private bank. But the most likely choice for most utilities is you're going to use federal or state loans and grants. And there are a number of sources of funding in Nevada. And I think that's going to be in the next session. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it today, other than to just introduce that there are a lot of different sources and to call attention to one particular source of funding, which is the state revolving loan fund, which the drinking water one started in 1996, and then the wastewater one started quite a bit earlier than that. And there are resources to help you get that funding, and I believe that again will be talked about in the next session. So just a little bit about considerations in managing your loans and grants if you're going to go down this path. There's just a couple of issues I wanted to bring up and bring to your attention because I think they're often forgotten. And one of them is milestones, and the other one is outputs and outcomes. So the construction projects for water and wastewater utilities last generally a long time. And many months is probably largely optimistic. It's more like several years is likely. So what if your project lasted 2 years and we only checked in on the project at the beginning and the end? It would be really hard to imagine that everything is going to run smoothly for this entire long period. And we would want to be able to make adjustments along the way if things aren't going quite right. If our expenditures are above what we thought, we ran into problems in construction, we would need to communicate with our stakeholders, such as our funders, our public, our elected leaders. We want to tell them how well we're doing with our project. And milestones are kind of what that is meant to be. These are sort of check-in points along the way so that you can tell how you're doing. So these are major and minor, if they're significant enough, accomplishments along the way to completing the project. These are not tasks, so the duration is 0 time. So they're just going to mark that you've actually reached a certain point. Like I put in 10 miles of pipe, or I have drilled 100 feet of well or something. So it's an actual accomplishment. It's not the task to get there. And they show forward movement in the progress of the project. And even someone who doesn't really know what all the steps were to get there could understand you've actually done it. So for example, I mentioned the pipe. You know, if you say, well, I've laid 10 miles of pipe and that was my milestone, nobody needs to know what it took to lay 10 miles of pipe, you know, how hard it was to dig trenches or how much time that took. They just need to know you've reached that milestone. So the milestones kind of tell the story of the project from start to finish. And how many you need is basically enough to monitor progress, allow for mid-course correction, but not so many that it's hard to manage or they have no meaning. So how do you tell if it's a milestone? Is the event highly important to the execution of the project? Can the event, decision, or action be used as an indicator of success? And if the event, decision, or action is not met on time, there will be serious impacts on the project completion. So a milestone is highly important, has a serious impact, and is an indicator of success. Now I want to talk a little bit about outputs and outcomes. So outputs are the numeric results of something. So when you think of bean counting, this is bean counting. Outputs count numbers of things. So numbers of people served by a water system, number of gallons of water produced, number of miles of pipe put in the ground. So these are literally things that you can count. Outcomes get into the level of performance, achievement, or quality that occurred because of this thing that you've done, this construction project. And it's really about the performance and assessment of success of the project. So these can be things like the increase in the percent of people served by water meeting EPA's drinking water standards, or reduction of a particular contaminant. So if we think about outputs and outcomes, which ones are a better measure of the effectiveness of the project? Well, I think you could argue that outcomes better tell what's going on. I mean, outputs are always good, but outcomes show the effectiveness of what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to build a project to show these outcomes, you want to describe the outcomes you're trying to achieve. You want to turn the outcomes you want to achieve into something that can be measured. So how would we measure that particular outcome? You want to confirm the outcomes are linked to the outputs and activities, basically that what you're doing will achieve these outcomes. And then implement the measurement of outcomes and track achievement, and then demonstrate the success, your success to the regulatory agencies, you know, based on the projects that you've done. So as the project's being considered, you know, anticipate these output and outcomes that you want to have along the way and monitor them, measure them, and make sure you communicate them, because they're really going to help you with the general public and your elected leaders and your funders. So lastly, we're going to talk about building internal capacity. So you might need to build internal capacity to qualify for funding, to accomplish the project, or achieve sustainability. So in 1996, with the Safe Drinking Water Act amendments, capacity development entered the picture. And capacity development is a continuous improvement process, and it means anybody, no matter where you are on the spectrum, can improve. And Nevada actually has a really good tool for you, and it's a capacity assessment form. And they also have really good information and resources on their website. But you can access a self-assessment for capacity development, and you can actually go through it on your own. And it might bring up really good information to kind of start you thinking about areas for improvement. You know, where am I doing really well? Where could I improve? And you might want to roll some of these activities into the overall project. So for example, we talked about Green Village had this water loss problem. One of the areas of the capacity assessment gets into water loss. So that might be a good way to look at the project and say, you know, we should build that into the project. So even if we were going to do the well, we should make sure we do water loss as well. You can get help from TA providers, either the EFC network, you can get the Rural Water, RCAP. Any of those organizations can help you look through your capacity assessment and give you advice and give you information about ways to improve. There are free resources out there. The efcnetwork.org website has some. And you can also build capacity with asset management. So I know that I think one of your other speakers talked about asset management. So we're going to kind of just give a real quick blurb about asset management and why it ties to capacity development. So the number one reason your water or stormwater or wastewater system exists is to serve your customers, as we talked about before. So the best reason to take on asset management is to better serve your customers. So by its very definition, asset management is meeting the desired level of service at the lowest lifecycle cost. So that desired level of service is all about serving your customers, and the lowest lifecycle cost is about better serving your customers. So if we think about the kinds of things our customers want, there's sort of boxes on the screen of all the types of things that they actually want. And the other big thing they want is almost every customer wants water to be low cost. So the problem you set up is that the amount customers pay provides your resources in time and money for what you can do to meet their requirements. So the financial resources don't always cover what the customers want. So what ends up happening is you have to spread your resources around. And you'll notice on the screen, you can't cover everything. Some will get done a lot, some get done a little, some don't get done at all. So the choices that you're making are going to have a big impact on what service the customer gets. So you have to think about whether or not you're meeting the highest priority service requirements, and how would you know if you're doing that or not? So asset management kind of helps provide the framework to make these decisions in the best way. So it has 5 major components. You know, what service do you want to provide? What assets do you have? Which ones are most critical to providing that service? How do you ensure that the assets do their job over their time? And then do you have enough money to get it all done? And these have the names of level of service, current state of the assets, criticality, life cycle costing, and long-term funding. And it turns out asset management is not actually linear the way I showed it. It's circular. Everything connects to everything else. It does not have a beginning or end. You just jump in from wherever you are and you just keep on going. And it's much more of a journey. It's not a destination. So this isn't something we're trying to get to. This is, you know, along the way, we will just keep asset management going. So asset management addresses much of the capacity development that we talked about earlier, but it creates a little bit more of a strategic framework, which is why we really like it. It gets you to a lot of the same places, but it's a little bit less nebulous. You can measure your starting point, you can measure progress, and it is a continuous improvement process. So where can you start? One option is just creating a map. It's fairly simple these days to do so. So if you don't have a map, that's a really good starting place. You can also establish a knowledge legacy. So if you have an operator, such as the case here where we were helping a small utility, this operator was leaving after 30 years and he needed to download as much information as possible before he went, so we were helping to do that. You can also start using data to improve decision making. That's another option. And when you're ready to begin, there are resources to help. The Southwest EFC site has a bunch of resources, but we also created the asset management switchboard, which is the picture to the right. And you can search for it as SWEFC switchboard, or you can get to it from our webpage. And it collects all of the state and local resources, all the free resources that are available for asset management kind of in one place. So it's fairly easy to access. And just one quick word about fiscal sustainability plans, if you're at all on the wastewater side. One thing that Nevada has done, which is great in the SRF program, is kind of merge asset management and fiscal sustainability together, because fiscal sustainability plans kind of leave a couple of key things out that asset management has, one of which is the level of service. So Nevada is merging these two processes together to kind of fix that issue. So as a wrap up, we want to identify the need for the project. Remember to think about the level of service you provide your customers. So what is the current level of service you're providing? And is the project you're contemplating going to help you increase that level of service? And if not, you know, do you need to rethink the project? Use data to back up the need. Make sure to perform a thorough alternatives evaluation. We don't want to forget the importance of planning, because again, that's where you have the most influence at the least cost. We want to engage professionals and work with them collaboratively. We want to think about how we're going to fund our projects. And one thing I should point out is if you have reserves to do replacements, don't forget that that money is available and is meant for that purpose. So you can use that to help pay for some of the replacements, especially the shorter term replacements. And then build your internal capacity to, help improve your sustainability and help you qualify for funding. And as I've said several times, help is possible. There is funding available through some existing grants that we have with EPA for small water utilities and soon to be small wastewater utilities as well. So we have got funded, the project hasn't yet kicked off, but we will have money for wastewater very soon. So on the website, there are places to go to sign up for workshops and webinars. Right now, they're all virtual, but sometime soon, we'll probably have some in-person ones again. There are resources available. There are blog posts available, and there is that place where you can request technical assistance that Maureen referenced earlier. So you can fill out a request form, and somebody within the network will help you. So with that, I will put the final slide on the screen. I know it was sort of a whirlwind tour of projects, but again, there are help and resources available from more than one place, from the state, from other assistance providers. So there's lots of help available to you if you want to take on any of these parts of the project.
Heather, thanks so much. Great cover. So much material to go through. I'm just trying to get a project going, but it was great. So many things to think about, and you covered it really, really well. The thing I really like about asset management, and even if you're pulling it together with fiscal sustainability plans, is that, as you highlighted, the adaptive management, right? Where you start on it, and you always do need to keep changing it, but there's always opportunity to look at something differently in that, and listen to your customers and that kind of thing. So appreciate it.
That's
so much.
why we love asset management so much. It's a really self-teaching type process, and you do not have to worry about jumping in with both feet. You can't screw it up. If you make a mistake, you just adjust. So you don't have to worry about like, oh gosh, what if I get it wrong? You don't have to worry about that. If you guess wrong at a level of service goal, you can change it. If you don't have all of your assets in your inventory, you can add something in later. So it's a very self-improving process that you really can start at any place and just keep on going forward.
And before, a couple of questions for you, but before, I'll just mention when you had reminded folks that there is technical assistance and training support from the EFCN, we did include that link in chat very early on in the day. So if you're interested in filling out that technical assistance form, that link is there for you. Okay, so first question for you, Heather. Do you know of any good examples of non-point source projects that have used Clean Water State Revolving Fund dollars?
I've heard of them. I don't have any good ones in my back pocket to share with you today, but I know that there have been projects like that that I've heard about in other locations. So I guess I'd probably refer to EPA's webpage on that. Because I know, like I said, I've heard people talk about those examples, but I haven't personally been involved in one of those just yet.
How about, do you have tips for developing life cycle costs that are required for some funding programs?
So what you want to do there is, it's super important to think about how, let's separate real quick here between existing assets and future assets. So if you have existing assets, we're looking at the life cycle from where we are today until it's going to hit the end of its useful life. So in those cases, we're going to kind of think about what is the history of that asset what has the history been, and then we can project forward based on that history. I think it's going to last another 10 years. These are the activities I do every year, so I need to cost those out, like replacing parts or lubricating. So if it's an existing asset, you're going to use as much history as you can to kind of project forward, and you're making your best estimate of how much longer that asset is going to last. You're not using age, You're using your best estimate of, based on everything I know, I can get another 10 years worth of life, or 5 years, or 20 years. Now, if we're starting from scratch, we want to think about our assets over their whole life, from when am I going to get that asset, going as far back to planning as you want, because the asset's life actually starts in planning, and the asset's life ends when it's decommissioned or, you know, put out of service. And you're going to want to think about what are all the costs related to operation. So what will you have to do to operate that asset? So how much energy does it take? How much electricity? Are there chemicals that are needed? Those sorts of things. Then how many maintenance activities, and when will those occur? Once a month, once a year? So you're going to want to put some costs related to that. You're going to want to think about any known repairs that you're going to have to make. Sometimes we anticipate certain components will fail, and we call those like known failures. And so you can program in, I expect this part to fail twice during the system's life. And then finally, these unexpected failures. There's always going to be some unexpected failures, you know, throw a little bit in for that, maybe a little bit for disposal. So you really want to think about, you know, every intervention I'm going to make over that life of that asset, that's going to go into its life cycle cost. And that's going to help me think about, you know, what is this asset going to cost me over the entire thing? And then what could I do? Once you know that, what can I do to shrink that down? Like, are there preventative maintenance tasks I could do? Could I maybe stretch out certain tasks? Like if I look at how the asset performs, maybe I can do this on a less frequent basis. So there's always ways you can try to optimize those costs. Once you kind of get your initial stuff down, you can optimize costs by looking at, well, what could I change based on how the asset is performing?
Great. Do you have a time frame that you would suggest for looking, as far as looking at a full utility life cycle costs, as far as 20 years or 50 years? Or
we actually like to look at the life of the longest asset. So theoretically, you really want to look out about 100 years so that you can catch pretty much all of your pipe. Now that means some of those assets get replaced multiple times. Now I know that's hard for utilities to do, so I would say a minimum 20. But the best case scenario, we're looking like 50 to 100 years down the road. And that's so that we know we can't put off our short-term assets. We have to do them now, because if we don't, those assets that are coming due 30 years from now, 40 years from now, you know, you're just going to stack up costs on top of costs. So sometimes just having that longer look prevents your elected leaders from putting too much off and saying, well, if I'm only looking 10 years out, I don't have to worry about it. I can just push those costs down a little bit. My term will be over. Well, no, you can't, because there's something in year 11, there's something in year 15, there's something in year 20. So the longer out you can stretch the cost, the harder it is to kind of put off those expenditures and trying to prevent people from like just pushing costs down the road, because it's not going to work. You're just going to end up with some catastrophic failures later on.
okay, another question related to outputs and outcomes. So you mentioned that outputs and outcomes are useful for communicating with your customers and your elected officials or board members, but are they sometimes useful or required to be identified, measured, and reported for any funding programs?
I will actually defer to the funders. I believe that some of them do request that. I don't know if they actually go so far as to say, you know, you're not going to get funded if you don't do this, or if your outcome doesn't match up, you know, there's going to be some kind of penalty. So I don't think that necessarily happens. But I think they are requested in some funders, like they want to know what are the outputs and outcomes of the funding. And again, it's just a really good communication tool of just, you know, why are you doing this? And I think if nothing else, it focuses you on why are you doing this project? Because if you can't answer what the outcome or outputs will be, then you're probably not really sure about that project. I mean, even in your own minds, if you never report it to anybody, having an idea of what the outcome of doing this is super important, because then as you're doing it, you're like, yeah, that's why I'm doing this project. I want to achieve this or achieve that. Because not everybody has a really good idea of why they're doing something. I mean, I've found it many times working with utilities that they're kind of moving down a path without a really clear idea of why they're moving down this path. So if you put those outputs and outcome measures and you have to develop them, it forces you to really think about your project. Like, what am I really going to get out of this? And if there's not much, well, do you really want to spend $1 million to not really have much of an outcome? You know, probably not. So I think, you know, the one example I gave you were the $5 million pipe. You know, what outcomes were they going to get? Not much. I mean, very little. So if they would have sat down and said, well, what are my outputs and outcomes? I think it would have become really obvious to them that that was the wrong project. So again, even if your funders don't require it, I highly recommend it because it just forces you again to think through that project, really scope it out, really think about what you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it, and you'll end up with a better project and probably save yourself some money.
Yeah, I know they help a lot with, you know, developing measurable objectives, right? And really kind of narrowing and focusing this the project. And then too, looking at what, you know, what you expect to get out of the project. A couple grants, stormwater grants in California in the past have required performance evaluation and assessment plans that included those outputs and outcome tables. This really kind of guide you in your thinking of project planning.
Exactly.
Let's see, is there one more question here? No, that was it. Heather, thanks so very much for your time. A lot of great experience, so many case studies and stories that you have to share, and we appreciate you taking the time and talking to us and the Nevada community about it. Please
And
reach
thank
out
you so
to
much for
Heather
having me. And
and the
don't
team.
forget to use that request for assistance form.
Yes, yes. Thanks so much, Heather. So we're going to go ahead and take a break now. I'll give you 5 minutes. We've been at this for a little over an hour and 15 minutes, just 5 minutes to stretch, get a drink of water. I'm going to fix my throat and we'll see you back. We've got some staff from Truckee Meadows Water Authority who are going to share with us their story on developing watershed plans and informing their funding plans. So we will see you very soon. We're going to go ahead and get started in about 1 minute. 1 minute warning, folks, or notice, I should say. All right, we'll go ahead and get started in about 1 more minute here. Rounding up our last panelists for today. As soon as I see them on with us, we can go ahead and get going. And then maybe Matt and Cara, if you guys could give me a verbal ready to go once your cameras are on and you're ready, I can go ahead and introduce you.
I'm all set, Maureen.
Great.
Me too.
All right, thanks. All right, great case study to hear about later. Hear about this afternoon, an integrated approach to water resource facility and funding plans in Nevada, specifically the Truckee Meadows Water Authority. Welcome Cara Steeland and Matt Bauman. I'll give you a little bio for both of them. Cara Steeland joined the Truckee Meadows Water Authority as a hydrologist, excuse me, in 2016. She helps manage water resources for the Reno-Sparks metropolitan area and led the update process for TMWA's 2020 to 2040 water resource plan. Cara was also key in the creation of a source water protection program for surface water and groundwater in the Truckee River watershed. Having previous experience in environmental consulting and with the U.S. Forest Service, she has a breadth of knowledge in surface water hydrology, water resource planning, and watershed science. Cara holds a BS in environmental science and an MS in aquatic sciences, both from the University of Michigan. And Matt, Mr. Bauman, joined TMWA as a financial controller in 2017 and oversees accounts payable, payroll, and the general accounting function for the organization. Mr. Bauman is also responsible for preparation of TMWA's Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, or CAFR. Mr. Bauman, a certified public accountant, graduated from the University of Nevada, Reno in 2009 with a bachelor's degree in accounting. He began his career in Reno with the public accounting firm Grant Thornton, LLP. After receiving his CPA license, Mr. Bauman went to work for Gradient Resources, a geothermal energy producer, as accounting manager, then most recently Klondex Mine Limited. Mr. Bauman began his career at Klondex as accounting manager, then he was promoted to operations controller, and finally corporate controller. So with that, I welcome you, Matt and Cara, and you can go ahead.
Great, thank you so much for the intro, Maureen. I'm just gonna let Matt share the screen and then I'll kick off the presentation and Matt will jump in a little bit.
Sounds good. And I think, am I waiting for a share link? There it is. Let's see if I can get this right this time. Okay. How's that look, Cara? We looking at the right thing?
We are, you just need to make it bigger and you're not on the first slide, it doesn't look like.
Okay, so then it's not the right thing. Okay.
That one looks like it's the right one, but it's on present. It's
Let me see here.
it's on the two screens. There you go.
How's that?
Still looks like it's on presentation or display mode or whatever it's called.
If you swap it one more time, I think it'll work.
Bounce back
Hit the
maybe.
swap. Yeah.
Is that, is it?
No.
Okay. Can we try to redo that share again? Tess, I don't know if that's
Yes.
you that do that.
Yep. 1 second. You guys might get a glimpse of a funky Excel table for a quick second while I redo everything. Okay.
And Matt and Cara, Jason Cooper from the Nevada Department of Environmental Protection says, glad to see you, Cara and Matt. Thanks for participating.
Oh, great. Hi, Jason. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't seem to want to let me do the other one. Okay, here we go. Nope, that's not it. Oh my gosh.
Now we're seeing maybe a customer's data.
So maybe should we go ahead and let Rich from my office share his slides so we can move forward?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, let me launch. Let me see. Here we go. Okay.
Always good to have a backup plan.
Right.
Everyone's-
All right. There we go. Okay.
So Matt and Cara, just let Rich know when you're ready to advance, or I know you have some animation, so if you need him to hit that for you, just say hit it or whatever. Thank you.
Sounds good. So we're gonna kind of take a little higher level approach than the last presentation and discuss TUMWA's integrated approach to water resource facility and funding plans. Next slide, please. So I'm just gonna give a brief overview of Truckee Meadows Water Authority. We also are known as TUMWA. So we are a not-for-profit community-owned water utility overseen by a 7-member board of directors from Reno, Sparks, and Washoe County. We were formed in 2001 as a public water utility. So we serve actually about 440,000 customers now. We've grown a bit since this slide was created, and we have about 20,000 wholesale customers. We rely both on surface water and groundwater resources, but we predominantly rely on the Truckee River, which provides about 80 to 85% of our total water supply. We have 2 water treatment plants, one which runs year-round and one that we use seasonally during peak demand season in the summer irrigation months. We also have our 89 production wells, which depending on the year provide about 15 to 20% of our total supply. Those are located throughout our system. And we also utilize an aquifer storage and recovery program. So we inject treated surface water into our wells during the winter months to help improve aquifer health. Fish Springs Ranch is part of our groundwater, our production wells, but it's our major importation project in the region, and that provides an additional 8,000 acre feet of groundwater supply. We also are finishing up our Mount Rose water treatment plant project, which is a large project in the south part of our system, which will utilize Whites Creek water rights. So we've had a lot of issues in the south part of the system when we acquired it from when we in 2015, we consolidated utilities, and there's a lot of issues with aquifer drawdown there. So that treatment plant will help improve aquifer levels down there and have another source of surface water supply. And we also, TUMWA doesn't supply reclaimed water, but we do collaborate with regional partners, and reclaimed water is used throughout the region for irrigation of golf courses and parks, et cetera. We have a great resource in our 3 hydroelectric plants. They're from the turn of the century, from the early 1900s. They're run-of-the-river plants, and those operate year-round as long as river supplies are available. Quickly looking at our annual revenue, and Matt will jump in and talk a lot more about our funding strategy in the next part of the presentation, but we did about 102.5 million in water sales, 3.3 million in hydro generation sales, and then 2.3 million in other operating revenue. Next slide, please. So just this map is a little hard to see, but it's kind of just shows you the extent of TUMWA's service area. You can see the light blue color shows that it extends pretty far to the north and south from the central Reno and Sparks area. And the 3 hydroelectric plants are indicated in yellow, which are kind of to the west of town. And we have a few satellite systems also. You can see one to the east of town that operate solely on groundwater. very small communities that are served just by those wells. And then all of the black dots indicate our pretty extensive network of production wells. Next slide, please. This just gives you a feel for the population that we serve and the water and our water production over time. You can see in the blue, we have our production. We're at we usually serve between 80 to 84,000 acre feet a year. And you can see population has been growing over time, but we've remained pretty steady in terms of our production. That's mostly due to our conservation program, metering all of our customers, just increased efficiency overall. So even though population's been increasing, we haven't necessarily been utilizing more water in the region, which is great from a conservation perspective. And then next slide, please. So what we're really going to focus on today, now that you have a little background on Tumwa, is our 3 plans and how we use those to really help determine how to guide the utility into the future. So we use an integrated approach with our resource plan, our facility plan, and our funding plan. You can see this little schematic over here, and it shows that they really all feed into each other. And then our customer rates and our facility charges also inform our funding plan. So I'm going to speak to the water resource plan and the facility plan, and then Matt will talk about our funding plan. So the resource plan provides a present day status update and outlook regarding Tumwa's water resources for the next 20 years. Our facility plan focuses more on infrastructure and provides recommendations to ensure reliable water distribution for the next 20 years. And then of course the funding plan determines our funding needs for utility operations and projected capital improvements over the next 5 years. Next slide, please. So our water resource plan, it's really an essential kind of high level planning document that analyzes how we will maintain the balance between supply and demand over the next 20 years. It takes into account of a lot of different variables that could impact our water supply and our water demand. So looking at things like economic development, our region's growing, how that could impact our water demand moving forward, looks at water rights and also environmental issues and climate variability. Next slide, please. So we actually just completed our 2020 to 2040 water resource plan last year. It's our 4th edition since Tumwa was created in 2001. We took a scenario-based planning approach where we did a lot of in-depth analyses of climate change and population growth impacts on water resources. I'm not going to get into that in this presentation, but it is available online if you're interested more in that piece of our planning effort. It provides an update about significant changes to the water system since the previous plan, looks at Tumwa's conservation and drought response policies, and also analyzes possible future water resources for the community. And that's kind of where I think this fits into this topic today, is how we come up with projects and fund them in the future. Next slide. I'm not going to run through all these, but this is basically what I just covered. But one of our goals for our plan is to create innovative solutions to best manage water resources in the region. And then another key goal of our planning process is to continue to maintain community confidence in our planning process. So we really want this to be a document that the community can look to and say, wow, Tumwa really, is looking towards the future and knows what needs to happen to ensure that we have a reliable water supply moving forward. Next slide. So in chapter 5 of our plan is where we identify future water resource projects. Our analyses in our plan show that Tumwa has a super robust water supply. We're super fortunate. We have a lot of upstream drought storage. We have a ton of backup supply in our wells. We have, the Truckee River is an incredible resource for us in this region, but we do recognize that we can further increase our reliability and the resiliency of our system, especially for drought periods, and with climate change and drier periods potentially in the future. So we do identify some potential future water resource projects in the resource plan. We take a really high level approach in this plan, so we don't detail cost estimates, facility layouts, or precise yield values. We more looked at potential projects, how much they could possibly yield, and we did look at the benefits and challenges of each of these projects at a very high scale in the plan. So each of the projects identified in this table, that's a little hard to read, I apologize for that, but each of those has kind of a benefit challenge table to indicate, how feasible are these projects moving forward. And the projects include things like treatment of existing groundwater resources, so areas we know that have water quality challenges, what we might need to do to address those challenges moving forward, looking at additional groundwater capacity, not mostly that would be like developing new wells to meet peaking capacity or system pressures, looking at expanding our ASR program, lots of different options for kind of more innovative stuff with creek water and Marlette water system and reclaimed water. So lots of different projects that are potentially out there. And this is where we start to identify what those projects might look like and how they could benefit Tumwa moving forward. Next slide, please. And then we move on to our water facility plan. So the 2015 to 2035 water facility plan is our most recent of our WFP. So it focuses on specific infrastructure projects that will be required to meet customer demand 20 years in the future. And I don't know if I mentioned this before, but the resource plan is updated every 5 years, as is the water facility plan. And this is also updated to account for projected demand, supply, and system changes. It focuses on verifying and modifying recommended capacity and facility sizing, reestablishing priorities, and determining the revised timing of recommended improvements. So it feeds off the previous version of the plan to see what needs to change moving forward, mostly due to demand, and then our system is constantly growing and changing. So figuring out what needs to be added in the future. It also identifies revised in-service dates and updated cost estimates for the recommended water system facilities moving forward. And again, it also is the basis for updating Tumwa's funding plan and our developer facility charges. Next slide. And so future water facility expenditures are estimated in the water facility plan. In our region, new development does pay for growth regionally. So you can see in this table here which costs can be allocated to growth and then which ones can't be. And so those that can't be allocated to growth would be things like fire flow deficiencies, off-river reliability, replacement of existing wells, storage for existing customers, and major main replacements. So those would be not in the allocated to growth because they're part of our existing system. Next slide, please. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Matt now, who's going to talk more about funding.
All right, thanks, Cara. So Rich, bear with me, there's some animations here, so I'll just say next every time and then it'll bring in something new to these slides as we go. So appreciate the help. So I want to talk pretty high level about what we look at as far as fiscal planning goes throughout the year. What I'm going to talk about we do every year, and it really starts at the beginning of the calendar year. Go ahead, Rich, next. So at the beginning of the calendar year, we start to develop our annual operating budget and capital improvement plan, or CIP, and we do this every year. We put that in front of our board of directors in March as a tentative budget. And then in April, go ahead, Rich, next. In April, we have to file that tentative budget with the state of Nevada Department of Tax. Go ahead, next. And then in May, we have our final budget and CIP. It's approved by the Tumwa board, and we file that with the state of Nevada Department of Tax. Just a little bit about what goes into developing our annual budget here is it really is ground up. So we look at how much we're going to spend on the operating budget side. Think of that as like an income statement. So focus is on operating expenses. We sit down with department heads and we look at what have we spent historically, what has our actual spend been, what have our historical budgets been, and we do this really on a line-by-line basis, cost centers, accounts. It's pretty detailed, and we really want to come up with as realistic of a budget as we can. That's on the spending side, and then we also project out revenues for the next year. So how much water are we going to sell? What's our water use look like on an individual basis by the different rate classes? And what are our water rates going to be the next year? And then we can project our revenues for the next year. And then as part of the CIP, or the capital improvement plan, we sit down with, again, department heads, a big focus on the engineering group, and come up with what projects do we need to continue to serve water to the existing customers, as well as facilitate growth that we know is upcoming. And so those are really the backbone behind our annual budgets. Again, those are submitted to the state of Nevada in June. And then if you go to the next one, and then roughly August, September timeframe, we start to develop what we call our 5-year funding plan. The 5-year funding plan is kind of the backbone of TUMWA's financial planning. It's a pretty high-level forecast, but we're looking at both operating budgets, CIP, debt service, and we're incorporating all of that into a 5-year forecast. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Go ahead, next slide. So capital improvement plan. So this is a component of the annual operating budget, as I stated on the last slide. And within the capital improvement plan, as I mentioned, we sit down with engineers, department heads, come up with what projects do we need over the next 5 years to serve the system. And these are included in these are rehabs, maintenance, replacement on existing projects, as well as new projects related to facilities and resources. Go ahead to the next. You can hit it twice, I think. So within the capital improvement plan, these projects are funded by really kind of 3 broad categories. The first being customer rates. So customer rates are going to fund anything that has to do with existing infrastructure. So one of our objectives that we try to follow financially for TUMWA is that growth pays for growth. So we don't want existing customers to be on the hook for expansion of the system. And so we identify specific projects, and then how are those projects going to be funded, and a big part of that is customer rates. Go ahead, next one. The next is developer fees. So developer fees are going to fund all the projects that are related to growth. And so these 2 categories, they make up roughly 80% or so of the overall capital improvement plan. Go ahead to the next one. The third is we have several items included in here, such as our sustainability fee, specified cash reserves, as well as any grants that might be funding certain projects within our capital improvement plan. So now our capital improvement plan ties back into the funding plan. And so go ahead, the next 2. And so within the 5-year funding plan, like I was saying, the capital improvement plan is a major component of that. And so if you think back to the timeline, just kind of walking this through, during the spring, we're developing our operating budget and capital improvement plan. We have pretty defined numbers because we've walked through in a lot of detail what we're going to spend money on, what the requirements are, and then we bring that into our 5-year funding plan. And go to the next slide, please. And so the 5-year funding plan has a lot of objectives. Again, it's kind of the backbone of our financial planning. So, but one of the main objectives is we develop something called the total cost of service. So also could think of this as a revenue requirement. And within that, we have our operating expenses. I talked about that. We developed that kind of from a ground up level. We have our debt service. We only look at debt on debt service on customer related debt when we're coming up with our cost of service. And then capital expenditures for existing infrastructure. This is the customer rate funded capital expenditures. And that all combines into our total cost of service. And we look at that number because that really tells us how we're going to do over the next 5 years, and it helps inform us as to where we can set our water rates so that we can meet that cost of service. Because if you think about the revenue that a water utility like us is going to generate, we can't really control the water use that customers are going to use. So we can't control the volume, but what we can control within reason is the price. And obviously one of our objectives is to keep customer rates as low as possible so that we meet that cost of service. But we do have to meet that cost of service. And so that's a really important number. Go to the next one. Some of the objectives of the funding plan, go ahead, is maintain recurring revenues sufficient to cover the cost to serve customers. So again, that's basically what I said. It's sort of the primary objective for TUMWA when we do our 5-year funding plan each year. Go ahead, next one. We want to maintain a debt service coverage ratio that meets bond requirements, but it also meets the board designated goal of 1.5 times. Go ahead. One of the things I haven't really touched on is we want to have sufficient cash balances so that we can fund any rehabilitative capital projects
on a pay-go basis. So we've been looking at sort of activity. Think of the income statement. How much are we spending, and then how much are we generating? Well, what's happening to our cash balance over time as well? And that's something that the funding plan informs us of. So if we see that we have what we would call a funding gap over time, where we are not generating enough revenue to cover the expected cost of service, if you think about it, you're going to see that cash balance start to drop, and that can create problems, right? And so we want to have enough cash in reserve so that we can fund things that come up that maybe we didn't plan for, or something that surprises us. So that's important as well. Go ahead, next one. And then lastly, we want to maintain high investment grade credit ratings so that we can access credit markets if we need to. For Tumwa, we don't like to. We've over time we've been paying down our debt. When Tumwa was established back in the early 2000s, we had close to $500 million of debt. We're down to close to $350 million, and we continue to pay that off. We don't like to take on more debt, and our strategy has been to avoid that. And so, excuse me, that's always the goal. But we also recognize that there may come a day when we do need to do that, and having good investment grade credit ratings is going to help us do that. And so that's something that we look at as well. Go ahead, next slide. And this is kind of a nice visual. I was talking about the funding plan, and if you look at that blue line there in the middle going across, that line over time is the cost of service or the revenue requirement. And what this is showing is historical and then also forward-looking information. And so that line is what we would need to generate in revenue to be sustainable from a financial perspective. The bars that are going up to that line that's the revenue. And so the closer you have those bars to that line, the better. Any difference there would be a funding gap. And if that difference continues over time, then that would be indicative of a problem, and potentially we would need to do something with our customer rates, or otherwise somehow reduce our cost of service or our revenue requirement. The orange line is the cash balance. It went up historically because of some one-off things that were really unrelated to our financial planning. But as that starts to come down a little bit, we have to keep an eye on that, because we can't have that to continue on a downward trajectory forever, obviously, because we can't run out of cash. And so this is kind of how the three primary, groups of financial information come together within our funding plan. And that's it for me. Next slide. I think Kara's going to wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So just to reiterate, we basically use our three plans to manage water resources, infrastructure, and funding. Our resource plan looks at kind of our overall supply and demand, mostly from a resource perspective. So that's our natural resources department predominantly that completes that plan. And then our water facility plan is much more engineering focused. So that's focused on our infrastructure. And then our funding plan is completed by our finance department. And that's how we're gonna actually be able to fund all the projects that we come up with in our resource plan and our facility plan. So each plan informs the other plans to ensure that Tumwa provides high quality water for its customers now and into the future. And ultimately, Tumwa strives to provide water to customers at affordable rates while mitigating risk through responsible capital planning, maintenance, and flexibility to handle unplanned needs. So we have a pretty large system, so there's always something unexpected popping up. So our ultimate goal is always to have a super reliable, resilient water supply. So that's how we plan into the future to make sure that that is always the case, so we can continue to provide that water for our customer base. Next slide. And with that, we'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you so much for your attention today. And that link there would take you to all of our plans you could access there. So our resource facility and funding plan, or I think maybe funding plans, I'm not sure, Matt, but definitely our resource and our facility plans are available there.
Yeah, the funding plan is actually not there, but you can look at our budget, capital improvement plan, as well as our annual CAFR, which is our finance report.
Thanks.
Matt and Kara, thanks so much for sharing your stories with us. 3 great plans that so much goes into, and it's neat how they all feed into each other. Kind of that adaptive management that we were talking about earlier. There's a couple questions that came in for you. Let me pull up the first one. Did it go away? I think I lost it. I think I lost that first. Oh, here, let me see if I can get it wider. All right, let me see. Okay, for when planning for growth in TMWA's area, CIP, what is the % of growth you plan for?
So in our resource plan, do you use, so we have a economist on staff that looks and does, works with our regional planning agency and does population growth estimates. And I believe that it feeds into our resource plan and our facility plan, I think the funding plan as well.
It does, yeah, and we roughly 2% is our increase in service connections at least each year. Has kind of been like the standard that we plan for and sort of what we've seen. So if that answers the question, I mean, and then that's all kind of tied into, again, what kind of infrastructure do we need to facilitate that kind of growth, and then that feeds into our capital improvement plan.
Okay. And what is involved in prioritizing projects for the 5-year capital improvement plan?
A lot. Yeah, that's always kind of the struggle. Is I think when we sit down and develop our plan, our engineering group, they want to do everything, and so it's sort of a there's a lot of goals in that plan, but really as far as priorities go, anything that's going to impact delivery of water or water quality obviously is going to be number one. And then what we do, and I don't think this is unique, but we really sit down with everybody in a room. We don't develop the CIP in silos. We sit down with everybody in a room who has a stake from the different departments, and we sort of lay out, okay, here's the first draft of the CIP, here's what everybody wants to do. And then we in the finance group go, that's too much. And then they start to whittle it down and prioritize together as a group and agree on, okay, well, I can push this a couple of years, or no, I really need to do this one this year because of this. And then we all understand and agree that those are the priorities. So the process that goes into developing the CIP is it's involvement from everybody, and I think we really sort of get buy-in from everybody as well, and that really helps the organization prioritize what we're going to do.
Yeah, great. There's a question about if you have any water reuse projects in any of your plans, and are you looking at any stormwater capture projects?
So we are working on a regional collaborative called One Water Nevada, and that is looking at advanced purified water. So that would be kind of the reuse side of things. So we're not looking currently to I mean, our plan looks out 20 years. So it basically mentions that we're involved in that advanced purified water study. And in terms of stormwater capture, no, I don't know from a water rights perspective if we could do that. We already have a lot of Truckee River rights, and we have a lot of upstream storage. So we actually capture, a lot of runoff upstream, and we'll hold it back up there. So we're not looking at stormwater capture at all.
Last question I have right now, has your revenue been hard hit by reduced collections since COVID, and what have been your strategies to cope?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, a year ago, there was a lot of unknowns. In fact, I went through, just talked about our budget planning process, and a year ago we had developed our tentative budget. We were getting ready to present it to the board in March, and then COVID kind of hit, right? And so we went back to the drawing board. We came up with some reduced revenues, specifically on the commercial side, because we knew that there was going to be a shutdown, and so we would likely see a drop off in our commercial water revenue. So we reduced that. We didn't really make much of an adjustment to residential water use. And then we updated our budget with that. We went into the year, and we actually saw higher than budget revenues all throughout the year. And really what we think drove that was just weather conditions. That's really the main driver in Ottumwa's revenue in any given year. It can really change the water use. Drier typically means people are going to water a little more, assuming we're not asking for conservation because of a drought. But so it was pretty dry last year, and so we did see a lot of water use. And then, as you would imagine, with people being home, we saw our residential water use go up quite a bit. We did see a drop off in commercial water sales, but that was so to give you a little context, our commercial water sales dropped roughly 25% from what we had budgeted or planned for. But that only makes up 12 to 15% of Tumwa's overall revenue. And so overall, our revenue was fine. Now on the collection side, we did see a drop, but it wasn't drastic. We did see an uptick in our aging of our accounts receivable. We stopped shutting off really and enforcing those kinds of collection things at different points during the pandemic, just to try to help people, because obviously we don't want to be shutting water off. But in general, we haven't seen our collections get too bad. I don't think it was as bad as we were fearing, which is nice.
Great, good to hear. Cara and Matt, great to have you. Thanks for joining us today. Good to hear your stories and all the work that's going on to keep Truckee Meadows going. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think, Tess, are you going to give me controls back? There we go. I think you should be able to see my screen. I'm going to move on and do a recap for us. So, well, that's the end of day 3 from the Nevada program and project funding for Nevada. We've mentioned a couple of different resources for you. You can check out our EFC at Sac State, the EFCN technical assistance request form is in chat. We will be sending videos of the recording from today. If you're interested in getting recordings of the other webinars from last week, those are available at the EFCN website. There are several funding sources that are available, and we're going to be focusing on those during our next webinar on Thursday, May 27th. We've got folks from the Nevada State Revolving Fund, USDA Rural Development, RCAC, EPA WIFIA, Nevada Governor's Office of Economic Development, Community Development Block Grant, and the Bureau of Reclamation all coming in and talking about the funding options that they have, and for grants and loans and eligible projects and tips for putting applications together. So we invite you to register for that. With that, my name is Maureen Kerner. I'm from the Environmental Finance Center at Sacramento State, and thanks so much for joining us today. Take care, everyone.
Thanks again for having me, and wish everybody well.
You too, Heather.